He watches the mysterious woman lead away his only horse, unaware her hidden fortune and secret goals may upend his entire life. A cold dread coils in his stomach as she vanishes down the road, leaving him to wonder what he truly surrendered. In the dusty outskirts of Greenock County, an old wooden farmhouse stood at the very end of a winding dirt road. Its paint had long since peeled under the relentless sun, revealing battered planks that whispered stories of struggle and resilience. This was where Oliver Reynolds, a humble farmer with calloused hands and a gentle heart, managed to eke out a life from the parched soil. Every morning, Oliver rose with the dawn, tending to the few animals he could afford to keep, chief among them a sturdy brown mare named Clover. She was no champion, but she was loyal, steadfast, and essential to keeping the farm afloat. Lately, times had been harder than usual. The harvests were meager, the land overworked and tired, and the well on Oliver's property threatened to run dry. Yet he soldiered on, always believing that persistence could coax fortune from adversity. He had never strayed far from Greenock, content to live a simple life of honest toil. Perhaps that was why he was astonished one summer afternoon, when a stranger arrived at his gate, a tall young woman in travel-stained boots, leading a tired stallion of her own behind her. She introduced herself as Margaret Lane. Though she spoke so softly that Oliver had to lean in to catch her words, she asked him for water, for shelter, and possibly for the loan of a horse in case her own mount wasn't fit to travel further. Her hands trembled slightly when she offered him a handful of coins, but Oliver waved them away. He was poor in wealth but rich in neighborly kindness. If a traveler was in need, what mattered was helping them. Margaret's eyes shone with relief, though Oliver noticed something guarded in her gaze. Without a second thought, Oliver invited her inside. The two sat at a rickety table near a cracked window, sharing a simple meal of boiled potatoes and leftover stew. Margaret apologized for intruding, but Oliver dismissed the notion with a warm laugh. He was used to living with little less, and hospitality was the one commodity he had in abundance. Clover neighed from outside, as if echoing her agreement. While Margaret ate, Oliver couldn't help but wonder what had brought such a refined stranger to this forgotten corner of the county. She might have been a traveling merchant or a wandering scholar, but her attire spoke of something else. Her boots were well crafted, her jacket finely made, and there was an air of confidence in the way she carried herself. Margaret, for her part, found herself just as curious about Oliver's life. She asked about his crops, the local climate, and how he managed such a sprawling plot of land on his own. He explained that his father had once owned a much larger estate, but poor weather and mounting debts forced them to sell off section after section. Now, Oliver held on to only 20 acres, scraping by with cunning and grit. He told her about Clover, how she'd been a gift from a distant cousin, and how she was more like a friend than a farm animal. Margaret listened intently, as though each detail were a key to understanding a secret. Eventually, Margaret admitted that her stallion, Orion, had traveled a great distance and was on the verge of exhaustion. She needed a fresh horse to complete her journey, though she hesitated to reveal exactly where she was headed. Oliver, intrigued by her secrecy, nonetheless offered to lend Clover for as long as she needed, on one condition: she had to promise to return the mare safely. Margaret's face softened, her eyes shining with gratitude. "I promise," she said, her voice laced with an earnestness that resonated deep within Oliver's heart. He nodded, content to trust this stranger who exuded sincerity with every word. Little did Oliver know that Margaret Lane was no ordinary traveler. She was a multimillionaire, an heiress to a vast real estate empire that spanned entire regions. Yet she had grown restless in her opulent life, consumed by the need to break free from the suffocating constraints of wealth and corporate demands. Quietly, she had set out in search of something intangible, genuine human connection, a place to invest not just her money but her passion, and people who would welcome her for who she was, rather than what she owned. The dust-covered farmland of Greenock seemed like an unlikely oasis, but something told her that what she was looking for might be found amidst its worn fences and gentle rolling hills. Margaret's plan was simple yet daring. She wanted to see the land as any local would, without fanfare, without the label of heiress clinging to her name. By presenting herself as a mere traveler, she hoped to encounter the authentic spirit of the county. If she discovered an opportunity to invest in a community that deserved growth and prosperity, she would do it under the radar, quietly funneling resources where they would do the most good. Despite her caution, she felt an odd comfort in Oliver's presence. His sincerity was like a soothing balm for someone who had grown weary of insincere flattery and opportunistic praise. That evening, Margaret strolled around the small farm, watching the sun dip below the horizon in a blaze of warm orange and pink. She marveled at how life moved here, unhurried and peaceful, with a rhythm dictated by nature rather than the ticking clock of boardroom meetings. When she returned to the house, Oliver was outside on the porch, tuning a battered guitar by lantern light. The gentle twang of the strings melded with the night's chorus of crickets. For a moment, Margaret stood quietly, entranced by the simplicity of that scene. It was in stark contrast to the grand halls and luxurious suites she had once called home. She joined Oliver on the porch, listening as he played a mellow tune that carried the weight of untold stories. He confessed that he used to play for his parents when the harvest was lean, lifting their spirits in the face of daunting hardships. Margaret felt a pang of envy. In her world, everything was easy to buy but difficult to feel. Money could acquire the biggest mansion, but it could not purchase the contentment Oliver displayed in this humble setting. The next morning, Margaret rose before dawn, determined to set out on Clover's sturdy back. Oliver met her at the barn, double-checking the mare's saddle and bridle with painstaking care. His furrowed brow betrayed his concern for Clover's well-being, and Margaret felt an unexpected surge of warmth. This man barely knew her, yet he entrusted his only horse to her for an indefinite time. "Don't you worry," she assured him, patting Clover's flank. "I'll take good care of her." Oliver simply nodded, though he lingered at the gate even after she disappeared over the crest of the road. Riding along the winding paths, Margaret tried to focus on the mission that had spurred her travels, finding a perfect spot for her philanthropic dream project. She envisioned a place where local farmers could learn innovative techniques, share resources, and break the cycle of crushing debt. She had glimpsed enough of Oliver's difficulties to know that the region desperately needed help. The land was fertile, but mismanaged by those with the power to enforce unfair land contracts and nearly impossible loan terms. As Clover's hooves kicked up dust, Margaret's mind raced with possibilities. Could she anonymously buy back the parcels of land once owned by Oliver's family, then lease them at fair prices? Could she create a communal co-op? The more she thought about it, the more determined she became. Yet amid her bold plans, she feared revealing her identity might shatter Oliver's trust. Still, she rode onward, hopeful. Margaret ventured deeper into the county with Clover's steady pace guiding her along uneven dirt roads. The summer heat bore down, intensifying the dryness that cracked the earth underfoot, and every so often she passed an abandoned plot of farmland overgrown with weeds. The sight tugged at her, reminding her of Oliver's quiet hopes. She paused at a crossroads to consult a battered signpost that leaned precariously, directions nearly faded. The sign promised a cluster of small villages ahead, places where she might learn more about local affairs and the struggles that plagued farmers like Oliver. Though Clover's breathing remained even, Margaret was mindful not to push the mare too hard. She was, after all, on loan from a man whose livelihood depended on her safe return. Gently patting Clover's neck, she murmured words of gratitude for the horse's reliable companionship. As she pressed on, the sun climbed higher, and the warm light cast long shadows across the rolling fields on either side of the road. She reached the first settlement by midday, a sleepy hamlet named Morningside with little more than a single row of shops and a modest inn. Margaret found an empty hitching post near the inn's porch and dismounted, guiding Clover to a wooden trough filled with water. The mare lapped at it appreciatively, her flanks flecked with dust from the journey. Margaret's own throat was parched, so she slipped inside the inn, a place that smelled faintly of stale ale and wood smoke. A kindly innkeeper greeted her, offering a cool drink and a spot to rest. Margaret sipped the tangy brew, quietly observing the handful of townspeople gathered in the main room. They spoke in low voices about the yield, about creeping debts, and about how a new wave of foreclosures threatened to claim farms across the region. Margaret's chest tightened at the mention of foreclosures. She couldn't help but think of Oliver and his precarious position. She wondered if he, too, might be on the brink of losing everything. Determined to learn more, Margaret engaged one of the patrons in conversation. He was a wiry man named Tobias, who had leather-tough skin and eyes that flicked from stranger to stranger with guarded suspicion. His voice was gruff when he spoke of the local land baron, a figure named Caspian Ware, who had a reputation for offering loans at steep interest rates. "Folk round here don't have much of a choice," Tobias grumbled. "We either take his terms and hope for rain, or watch our land dry up and starve," Margaret nodded, absorbing every detail. She knew all too well how predatory lending could choke the life out of small communities. As Tobias went on, she learned that Caspian Ware's men were rumored to travel the county, pressuring farmers to sign new agreements they could barely afford. Hearing such stories ignited a slow anger in Margaret, one that reminded her why she had left her plush city life in search of a place to invest in real change. After thanking Tobias for his time, Margaret retrieved Clover from the water trough and set off again. A plan was starting to take shape in her mind, one that might help turn the tide for farmers like Oliver before they fell prey to unscrupulous lenders. She knew it would require diplomacy, discretion, and not a small amount of resources. But first, she needed to see more of the county, gather more stories, and determine exactly how deep these problems went. As she led Clover along a narrow lane lined with dried corn stalks, Margaret allowed herself a moment of reverie. She remembered the board meetings she used to attend, grand rooms filled with polished mahogany tables and executives who spoke only of profit margins. She had grown restless amid that opulence, longing for a chance to use her influence for something more meaningful. Perhaps, she mused, Greenock County was exactly the place to start. By late afternoon, Margaret arrived at a second settlement, smaller than Morningside, with just a few houses clustered around a dilapidated chapel. She spotted a barn behind one of the homes, its doors wide open. A graying farmer named Ethel emerged, eyes narrowing suspiciously at the newcomer. Margaret greeted her politely and asked if there was a spot where Clover could rest overnight. Ethel hesitated, but then shrugged, gesturing for Margaret to bring the mare inside. The barn was clean enough, and Clover nickered softly as Margaret removed her saddle and brushed her down. The farmer's expression softened when she saw the care Margaret lavished on the animal. "Not many passers-by show that kind of gentleness," Ethel remarked. Margaret only smiled. recalling how Oliver's unwavering kindness had inspired her to do the same. Over a supper of cornbread and soup, Ethel revealed that she, too, was behind on payments to Caspian Ware. "I've got 3 months left," she said, voice trembling, "and then the land goes to him." Margaret's heart clenched at Ethel's despair. Thoughts spun in her head. The farmland here, though parched, was salvageable if managed properly. There were grants for irrigation, methods of crop rotation, even advanced training that could revitalize a weary plot. Yet none of that would matter if Caspian Ware snatched the land away first. Margaret longed to explain that she had the means to intervene, but she held back. She remembered Oliver's unguarded trust, how freely he had given Clover without suspecting that she might be a wealthy heiress. Revealing herself too soon could jeopardize everything. She needed to proceed quietly. "Have hope," she murmured, laying a comforting hand on Ethel's shoulder. "Sometimes fortunes can turn when you least expect." Ethel's tired eyes glimmered momentarily, though she likely assumed Margaret's words were mere pleasantries. In truth, Margaret was already planning how to direct her vast resources behind a discreet shell company, or perhaps a philanthropic trust that could buy out those debts at fair rates. In the morning, Margaret set out again with Clover, leaving Ethel's farm behind. The ragged countryside unrolled before her in a tapestry of sun-scorched earth and withering crops. She began making a mental list of the resources that would be required: better irrigation, stable loans, agricultural education, and a sense of community among the farmers who had become isolated by fear of losing everything. Every so often, she dismounted to check Clover's hooves, ensuring the mare was not overtaxed. Oliver's beloved horse seemed resilient enough, but Margaret was keenly aware of her responsibility. Late that afternoon, she paused by a shallow creek, letting Clover drink while she rested in the shade. She took out her notebook, a small leather-bound journal in which she carefully recorded her observations. The list of tasks to tackle had grown even longer, yet instead of feeling overwhelmed, Margaret felt invigorated. For the first time in years, she sensed real purpose in her work. By the time dusk fell, Margaret decided to camp near the creek rather than risk traveling in darkness. She unfurled a thin bedroll, built a modest campfire, and let Clover graze on the sparse grass. Gazing at the sky ablaze with stars, she felt the weight of her double life pressing upon her. It was true that she could solve these farmers' financial troubles with a mere wave of her pen, but doing so openly would invite a flurry of unwanted attention. Caspian Ware would instantly perceive her as a threat, and the local community might grow suspicious of her motives. She needed to tread carefully to ensure that her help would be accepted rather than dismissed as pity from a stranger. The crackle of the fire lulled her into introspection. She remembered her grandfather's stories, how he had started their family's fortune with a single plot of land, determined to treat his workers fairly and invest back into the soil. Margaret found herself wondering whether she was carrying that legacy forward in the best way possible. When she woke the next morning, the sun had barely risen, painting the horizon with delicate pink and orange hues. Clover munched quietly on a patch of clover, a small coincidence that made Margaret smile. She packed up her belongings and resumed her journey, heading back toward the main road that would loop around to Oliver's farm. Along the route, she passed more abandoned fields and shuttered homesteads. It was almost eerie, as though ghosts of former prosperity lingered in the peeling paint and sagging roofs. As the hours slipped by, she approached a small lake surrounded by willows, their branches swaying in a light breeze. She paused there, letting Clover rest, and stared at the reflection of the sky in the water. This place, though battered, still had a stark beauty. She imagined it flourishing again, families working the fields without the constant threat of crushing debt. A flicker of hope sparked in her chest. Finally, as twilight settled once more, Margaret found herself at the familiar fence line of Oliver's farm. The sight of the crooked mailbox and the worn path felt unexpectedly comforting, like returning home. In the distance, she saw Oliver standing by a rickety wooden cart, stacking a small load of firewood. His face lit up when he spotted Clover, and he waved, clearly relieved that the mare had returned safe. Margaret's heart skipped a beat at his open display of gratitude. It had been so long since she had known such unselfish warmth. Leading Clover up the driveway, she steeled herself for the inevitable questions. Where had she gone? What had she seen? She dismounted slowly, patting Clover's neck before turning to Oliver, who studied her with kind but searching eyes. He said nothing at first, just stretched out a hand to take Clover's reins and gently inspect the mare's legs. After confirming she was unharmed, he glanced back at Margaret, the unspoken question lingering in the air. Margaret slipped her foot from the stirrup, feeling the dust of the road settle around her ankles as she dismounted. She led Clover to the barn, each step measured, each breath reflecting her need to form the right words. Oliver followed silently, concern etched in the creases of his brow. When Clover was finally unburdened of saddle and bridle, Margaret turned to face him. She could sense his relief at seeing the mare safe, but also the weight of all that remained unsaid. He broke the quiet first. "I take it your journey went well," he said, trying to sound casual. Yet she detected a hint of worry in his eyes, as though he feared she might vanish again, or that her silence hid unwelcome news. Margaret nodded, summoning a reassuring smile. "Clover was wonderful," she replied softly, brushing a speck of dirt from the mare's side. "She carried me everywhere I needed to go, not a single complaint. Thank you, Oliver. I don't know what I would have done without her." Oliver's lips curved in a gentle grin. "I'm just glad you both made it home in one piece." The word home caught in Margaret's mind, stirring a warmth she hadn't felt in her suite of luxury condos or marble-floored penthouses. It was an odd feeling to discover that a place so humble could resonate with a deeper sense of belonging. They fed Clover, then stepped outside, the late evening sky dimming into purples and grays. Fireflies flickered over the fields, an impromptu dance of tiny lights. Oliver gestured toward the front porch, where two worn chairs waited. He offered her a seat, and she sank into the chair's faded cushion, folding her hands in her lap. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, content just to watch the stars blink awake. Eventually, Oliver cleared his throat. "I appreciate you bringing her back safe. She's all I've got, you know." He hesitated, then added, "But I can't help wondering what you saw out there. You've been gone a spell, and I suppose I'm curious if you found what you needed." Margaret considered his question carefully. She wanted to tell him everything, to spill her plans about reversing the region's mounting debt, about saving families like his from the brink of foreclosure. But she also knew she had to tread lightly. Oliver's trust was a fragile gift, one she dared not shatter with a careless admission. Instead, she opted for a measured response. "I saw enough to know this place is in trouble," she said gently. "A lot of hard-working folks are barely getting by, and lenders seem to be tightening the noose. It doesn't take a genius to see how that could end." Oliver nodded, his face tinged with a sadness that looked all too familiar. "It's been that way for a while now," he admitted. "My dad fought to hold on to this land. He'd been doing the same, but these last few years have worn me down. Sometimes I think I'll wake up and there'll be a letter tacked to my fence saying I have 30 days to clear out." Margaret's chest clenched. She had heard similar fears from the people she met in Morningside and at Ethel's farm. Each story echoed with the same despair. "Are you behind on payments?" she asked gently. He took a moment to respond, and when he spoke, His tone was resigned. "Not yet, but I reckon it's only a matter of time. Crops haven't been good, and the price of feed for clover keeps inching up. If I can't harvest enough to sell at market next month, I might have to give up the last of my fields." He folded his hands together, knuckles white. "Truth is, I'm at my wit's end." Margaret suppressed an urge to reassure him with promises of funds she technically could provide. She understood that if she began offering money out of the blue, it might spark suspicion, or worse, wound his pride. Oliver was the type who wanted to stand on his own 2 feet, and though pride could be a stumbling block, she admired the dignity it represented. "Sometimes help arrives from unexpected places," she said softly, her eyes on the dark shapes of farmland stretching into the horizon. "When I was riding around, I kept thinking that if everyone banded together, shared knowledge, formed co-ops, helped each other financially, they could outlast these predatory lenders. Imagine if farmers combined efforts instead of struggling alone." Oliver exhaled a half laugh, half sigh. "That'd be nice. But around here, folks are mighty private. They don't often trust strangers, let alone each other. Still, maybe that's the only way." His gaze flicked to her, a gentle puzzle in his expression. "But you don't strike me as a traveling merchant or a teacher. Why do you care so much?" Her heart skipped at the question. She could sidestep it with a vague remark, or she could offer a piece of the truth. Sighing inwardly, she opted for partial honesty. "I've seen how wealth can twist people," she said. "I've watched entire industries get shaped by greed, leaving ordinary folks behind. It doesn't sit right with me. I want to learn how to make a difference, from the ground up." Oliver studied her for a moment. Then, as though satisfied by the sincerity in her voice, he nodded. "Well, if that's so, you're in the right place. We got enough trouble here to fill a whole book." He shook his head, a rueful smile on his face. "But we also got land worth saving. I truly believe that." They lapsed into a comfortable silence, the crickets taking over with their nightly chorus. Somewhere in the fields, Clover whinnied softly, as if bidding them good night. Margaret closed her eyes, breathing in the fragrance of damp earth and the subtle sweetness of wildflowers. The moment felt peaceful, yet her mind churned with plans. She had made acquaintances in the county, people like Ethel and Tobias, who might be open to forming a community trust. She mentally noted that she would have to track down the details of these loans, maybe even purchase the notes from Caspian Ware under a discreet alias. That would grant her the power to lower interest rates or extend the repayment periods, giving farmers a fighting chance. But for now, all she could do was rest. Oliver offered her the same modest room she'd slept in before, a simple space with a creaking cot, thin curtains, and a hand-stitched blanket that smelled of lavender. She thanked him and tucked herself in, the exhaustion from her travels melding into a quiet resolve. As she drifted off to the chirping of night insects, she resolved to act swiftly but with caution. In the morning, she rose to the aroma of coffee. Oliver was in the kitchen, frying a couple of eggs in a pan chipped around the edges. He served them alongside thick slices of bread, a meal simple yet comforting. "I reckon you're used to fancier breakfasts," he joked, though his voice held no bitterness, just an honest acknowledgement of their different worlds. Margaret smiled over her steaming mug. "Trust me, nothing tastes better than a home-cooked meal after days on the road," she said, savoring the earthy notes of the coffee. She looked out the window, where sunlight slanted across the yard. Clover was grazing peacefully, occasionally lifting her head to watch passing birds. For a heartbeat, Margaret wondered if she could remain here indefinitely, free from the veneer of wealth. The impulse surprised her with its intensity. After breakfast, she followed Oliver out to his fields. Together, they surveyed the stunted stalks of grain. He explained the dryness, how he'd tried rotating crops but lacked the funds to invest in better irrigation systems. Margaret knelt in the dusty soil, rubbing it between her fingers. "Water is key," she murmured. "Sometimes you can apply for government programs or use drip irrigation. There might be grants for that sort of thing." Oliver cocked his head. "You seem to know a fair bit about farmland for a traveler. Where'd you pick all that up?" The edge of tension in his voice forced her to tread lightly. She forced a small laugh. "I've done some reading. Different places have different methods. I guess I'm just curious about what works." He offered a nod, accepting her explanation, at least for the moment. Then he dusted off his hands and stood, scanning the sky as though it might deliver a miracle. "Clouds look heavy today," he noted. "If we're lucky, we'll get rain by nightfall." That evening, a slow drizzle did come. Margaret and Oliver took shelter on the porch, watching droplets form rivulets in the dirt. The musty air felt charged, like the land itself was sighing in relief. As the rain picked up, Oliver eyed a small pail that caught water seeping through a crack in the roof overhead. "Always something else in need of fixin'," he said, half laughing. Margaret rose to her feet, stepping off the porch and into the gentle downpour, letting it soak her hair and clothes. She extended a hand, relishing the cool splatter against her palm. Oliver watched her with amusement, though he soon joined her in the yard, tipping his face skyward. It was an odd, joyous moment, drenched in the unspoken wish that nature's generosity might rescue them from ruin. That night, as the storm clouds passed, Margaret lay awake in bed. The roof still dripped in a steady rhythm, lulling her into a calm state between wakefulness and dreams. She found herself recalling the corporate offices she had left behind, the sterile glare of fluorescent lights, the hush of men in tailored suits. What a strange twist, she thought, that she felt infinitely more alive here, with only the crickets and an occasional breeze to accompany her thoughts. Morning arrived with a diffuse grey light filtering through the threadbare curtains. Margaret dressed quickly and slipped outside to find Oliver already at work, piling debris from the storm into a wheelbarrow. The land still glistened with moisture, though the sun was steadily peeking through. Without a word, she grabbed a spare rake and started helping, the repetitive motions freeing her mind to think about next steps. Oliver regarded her from beneath the brim of his worn hat. "You could head on your way, you know," he said gently. "You've returned clover like you promised." Margaret paused, leaning on the handle of the rake. "I could," she allowed, "but where else would I go right now? Besides, I'm not ready to say goodbye just yet." She wasn't lying. The notion of leaving this fragile but hopeful farm felt premature. There was still work to do, visible only to her, perhaps, but very real in her heart. And a new thought had taken root. Maybe, just maybe, she could persuade Oliver and others to join forces in a pilot co-op. If they consolidated their assets and knowledge, they might stand a fighting chance. She had the capital, even if no one knew it yet. All she needed was their willingness. Oliver gave her a curious look before nodding. "Suit yourself," he said, pushing the wheelbarrow forward. "I'm not one to refuse free help." Margaret smiled at his dry humor. Together, they toiled in silence, clearing broken branches and mending minor damage to the barn. The air held the pungent smell of rain-drenched soil, and she caught glimpses of Clover wandering around the pasture, occasionally tossing her head as if reveling in the fresh, damp breeze. With each passing hour, Margaret felt more certain this was where her mission had led her, to a weary land that deserved a new beginning. She would provide the means quietly until the time was right to show her hand. Margaret woke to a hush over the farmland, dawn's rosy glow sneaking through the barn's wall slats. She'd chosen the barn loft for her nights, preferring the sweet scent of hay and the soft lull of Clover's gentle breathing. Oliver insisted she use the house's spare room, but she cherished her private space for reflection. This morning, as she climbed down the ladder, she felt renewed purpose. She intended to quietly speak with more neighbors, gauging who might welcome the idea of a cooperative arrangement. With financial backing funneled discreetly from her family trust, she hoped to save farmers from ruin, but one misstep might raise suspicions. She also wished to avoid clashing with Caspian Ware prematurely. Her best course was to remain an unassuming traveler, only revealing her intentions when the time was right. She inhaled the cool morning air and headed to the kitchen, where Oliver was already frying eggs, the scent of sizzling butter mingling with that of fresh coffee. After breakfast, they decided to visit an elderly couple named the Thompsons, who struggled to manage their land. Oliver hitched a small cart to Clover, loading preserves and eggs as gifts. The sun overhead brought oppressive heat, and Margaret noted swaths of scorched soil, yet she saw potential in every dusty field. She remembered reading about water-saving irrigation and wondered how to bring such ideas here without revealing her wealth. They passed a derelict farmhouse, windows broken and roof caved in, a stark symbol of how quickly hopes could wither. Oliver said little, but occasionally he'd glance her way with a faint, reassuring smile, as if encouraging her unspoken plans. When they reached the Thompsons' homestead, Mrs. Thompson tottered onto the porch, leaning on a cane. Her face brightened at the sight of Oliver, and Margaret bowed her head politely, offering the small gifts. Inside, over cups of lukewarm tea, the old woman's trembling voice painted a grim picture of mounting debts and relentless late fees. "They keep adding charges we never agreed to," Mrs. Thompson fretted, hands shaking against her cane. Margaret glanced at Oliver, who nodded solemnly. "Don't worry," he said, his voice steady. "We'll help you sort it out." Sometimes these lenders rely on folks being too scared to fight back. Margaret's mind churned with ideas. If only she could buy out these debts quietly, rewriting the terms to something humane. But moving too openly might provoke Caspian Ware's ire, and she wasn't ready for that confrontation. After promising to return soon with more guidance, they set off again. The cart's wheels rattled over dry ruts, Clover plodding dutifully along. Margaret sensed Oliver's mood had darkened. The Thompsons' story was a reminder that no one was safe. At last, Oliver sighed. "This land can be cruel, but it's home." The simple conviction in his voice tugged at Margaret. She vowed to protect his home, even if he never fully understood her role behind the scenes. That evening, they dined on roasted squash and beans beneath the wavering light of a kerosene lamp. Margaret studied Oliver's face. Lines of worry etched his features, yet he still managed a smile when their eyes met. Deciding to gauge his reaction, she spoke of a concept she'd been mulling over. What if we pooled resources? Like a co-op, farmers around here could share equipment, seeds, maybe even labor. Oliver set down his fork, brow furrowing. "Folks round here are proud," he said gently. "They're used to doing things alone." Margaret leaned forward. "Yes, but if we don't adapt, we'll all lose. Strength in numbers might be our best bet." Oliver exhaled, nodding slowly. "You make a point. Maybe we start small, get a few neighbors on board." Excitement flickered in Margaret's chest. She had never felt so sure of a mission. They cleared the plates, a sense of possibility humming in the air like a faint but insistent chorus. The following day, they rode into Morningside to find Tobias, the gruff man Margaret had once met in the local inn. He stood outside the feed store, arms folded, gaze wary. Oliver greeted him, then carefully explained the co-op idea. Tobias snorted. "You're dreamers, both of you," he muttered, shifting his stance. Margaret refused to back down. "It works in other places," she insisted. "You share risk, you share rewards." Tobias's frown deepened, but eventually he relented enough to say, "I'll come listen. Don't expect miracles." Next, they visited Ethel, who was struggling with overdue bills. She offered a curt nod. "If it keeps me from losing my land, count me in." As they left, Margaret couldn't contain her growing optimism. Two of the most skeptical souls in the county had agreed to a meeting. That night, she hunched over a makeshift desk in Oliver's living room, scribbling ideas and budgets, already planning how to funnel her money into the co-op undetected. Late in the evening, thunder rumbled over distant hills, and a slow rain began to drum on the roof. Margaret sat near a window, watching drops streak the glass. Oliver approached, arms crossed. "You've been busy," he said, gesturing at her scattered notes. She nodded, biting her lip. There's a lot to figure out." He studied her, concern mingling with curiosity. "Margaret, I appreciate all you're doing, but I still don't know why." She hesitated, then closed her notebook, choosing her words carefully. "I've seen powerful people destroy lives for profit. I can't stand by. I want to help folks like the Thompsons, people who deserve a chance." Oliver's shoulders eased. "It means a lot that you're here." "I just hope you won't be disappointed." She managed a small smile. "I believe this place can thrive again." Outside, the rain intensified, as if nature applauded her conviction. In that moment, she felt a surge of resolve that drowned out any lingering doubts. Over the next 2 days, Oliver repaired fences, while Margaret quietly reached out to a contact in the city, an old friend who specialized in real estate law. She penned a careful letter, disguising her identity and explaining her intention to acquire farmland liens at fair valuations. If her friend could find a legal pathway, Margaret could become a silent benefactor. Meanwhile, Oliver noticed her occasional secrecy but said nothing, trusting her enough to let it lie. She took every spare moment to learn more about local farming methods, sometimes questioning Oliver about seed varieties or irrigation channels. He teased her for her relentless curiosity, yet patiently answered each query. Each evening, they compared notes on who might attend the gathering and who needed gentle coaxing. Rumors traveled, and more farmers expressed tentative interest. By the eve of the scheduled meeting, the air at Oliver's place felt charged, as though everyone sensed a shift was near, even if they didn't fully understand it. At last, the afternoon of the co-op meeting arrived. A handful of wagons and horses gathered near Oliver's barn. Ethel stood with arms folded, Tobias paced by a water trough, and a few more farmers loitered in clusters, whispering anxieties. Margaret breathed deeply, stepping forward to greet them. Her pulse throbbed in her temples. This was the first time she'd addressed them openly about collective action. Oliver offered a quick nod of encouragement. "Welcome, everyone," Margaret began, voice trembling at first, "and thank you for coming." She explained how a co-op might help them reduce costs and protect each other from unfair lending. Gradually, the tension eased. Ethel asked sharp questions about profit sharing. Tobias demanded guarantees. Margaret responded calmly, drawing on her hidden expertise. By the time she finished, curiosity replaced most of the initial skepticism. Their expressions weren't brimming with blind faith, but neither were they dismissive. As the group dispersed to mull things over, Oliver caught her eye and gave a grateful smile. In that unspoken moment, Margaret felt certain change had begun. A subdued buzz lingered in the farmyard long after the wagons and horses departed. Margaret stayed by the barn, replaying the meeting's highlights in her mind. She'd presented her co-op vision with as much clarity as she could muster, and though the farmers had shown caution, at least they'd listened. Oliver joined her, wiping sweat from his brow as he came around the corner. A faint smile played at the edges of his lips. "You did all right, Margaret," he said. "Even Tobias seemed curious, and he's usually the first to slam the door on a new idea." She shrugged, trying to mask her relief. "I just hope it's enough. We're fighting against a lot of fear." Oliver offered a slow nod. "Fear's mighty powerful, but so is hope. It's the first real spark we've had in ages." They lapsed into thoughtful silence, gazing at the dusty yard where hoofprints still marked the ground. Though the day's heat was receding, the air remained heavy, charged with the possibility of change. That evening, a restless wind swept through the valley, rattling loose shutters and sending swirling clouds of dust across Oliver's property. Margaret watched the dimming sky from the porch, hugging her arms to shield herself from the sudden chill. She noticed Oliver pacing by the chicken coop, lantern in hand, as if the breeze had unsettled him too. They reconvened in the kitchen over cups of herbal tea, each lost in separate thoughts. "I wonder if I should try talking to the banks," Oliver murmured. "See if they'd ease their terms a bit for folks who join the co-op." Margaret considered his words carefully. She knew the local banks might be under Caspian Ware's thumb. "It can't hurt to ask," she replied, "but we have to be prepared for pushback. Ware and his men might see the co-op as a threat to their control." Oliver sighed, setting his teacup down with a soft clink. "People here deserve better. If Caspian doesn't like it, well, that's his problem." News of the co-op spread over the ensuing days, borne by rumor and quiet conversation at the feed store or the local diner. A few more farmers approached Oliver to say they were thinking it over, torn between the promise of a united front and the risk of drawing Ware's ire. Margaret redoubled her efforts behind the scenes, writing to her contact in the city, requesting updates on her hush-hush plan to purchase delinquent loans. Each afternoon, she worked in the fields or helped Oliver fix fences, all the while listening, observing, and gathering scraps of information about who might be on the brink of foreclosure. The letters from her legal friend arrived sporadically, each one a small step closer to forming a clandestine safety net. At night, she lay awake in the barn loft, listening to the wind rustle the rafters and longing for the day she could lift this weight off everyone's shoulders. She was determined to remain unseen by Caspian Ware until her preparations were watertight. But Ware's presence drew ever closer. One afternoon, as Margaret and Oliver finished loading a cart with fresh vegetables for market, two riders appeared at the farm's edge. Their silhouettes were stark against the midday sun, hats pulled low over their eyes. Margaret's stomach twisted as they rode up to the fence without dismounting, surveying the property as though they owned it. Oliver set down a crate and walked over, forcing a polite nod. "Afternoon," he greeted curtly. The taller rider, wearing a black vest and a sneer, spoke first. "You, Oliver Reynolds." At his confirmation, the man handed over a rolled parchment. "This here's a new memorandum from Mr. Ware. Don't want no confusion about interest rates." His companion let out a cold chuckle. Margaret stood back, tension coiling in her gut. She suspected this was more than a routine notice. It was a demonstration of power. Oliver unrolled the parchment and scanned its contents. Though his face remained calm, Margaret spotted a tightening at his jaw. "I see," Oliver said quietly. "Tell Mr. Ware I understand." The riders nodded once, turned their horses, and departed in a cloud of dust, leaving Oliver clutching the paper as though it might burn him. When Margaret approached, Oliver passed her the notice without a word. Scanning the document, she felt a rush of anger. The new terms imposed higher penalties on late payments, an obvious attempt to squeeze farmers even harder. "He's trying to corner everyone before we can gain traction with the co-op," she muttered. Oliver gave a grim nod. Seems that way. But I'm not giving up. I'm done letting Caspian push folks around. A fierce resolve burned in his eyes, echoing Margaret's own determination. That night, they convened an impromptu discussion with Tobias, Ethel, and a handful of neighbors under the shade of Oliver's barn. The storm lanterns cast long shadows on the straw-strewn floor as voices rose in anxious debate. "Ware's not just a lender," Tobias growled. "He's got clout in the county offices, could shut us down if we pushed too hard." Ethel shook her head. "But if we roll over, what's left for us?" "This co-op might be our only shot," Margaret cleared her throat, drawing their attention. "We can't let him scare us into submission," she said calmly. "We keep organizing. We finalize a plan to share resources and stand up for fair lending." She paused, hoping she sounded confident enough to convince them. "And if we show unity, maybe we can apply for grants or state funds. We don't have to face him alone." A few heads bobbed in cautious agreement. Tobias still wore a scowl, but he said nothing, arms crossed as though hugging his doubts. Ultimately, they agreed on a follow-up meeting in a week, giving each farmer time to gather supporting documents and learn more about potential relief programs. Margaret stayed up long after the others departed, pacing in the barn. With each anxious step, she reminded herself that her clandestine plan to purchase certain farm loans might soon bear fruit. She just hoped it wouldn't arrive too late. Days rolled into a tense rhythm. Margaret felt the edges of her double life fraying each time Caspian Ware's name came up in conversation. She itched to reveal her hidden resources, to point and say, "Don't fear him. I have the means to undo his grip." But caution kept her silent. She wanted to shield Oliver and the others from blowback should Ware discover her identity. Whenever doubts gnawed at her, she found solace in small victories, a letter from her legal friend confirming that discreet negotiations to buy overdue notes were underway, or a new farmer voicing approval of the co-op plan. She and Oliver also started distributing basic tips on soil improvements and crop rotation, gleaned from her background research. The farmers seemed relieved to have new strategies, no matter how modest. One afternoon, she accompanied Oliver to the local market, hoping to sell fresh produce for a bit of extra cash. Stalls lined the dusty town square, with vendors hawking everything from eggs to handmade quilts. Margaret felt self-conscious at first. So many watchful eyes, yet as she helped Oliver stack vegetables, she heard encouraging whispers about their co-op idea. "Heard Reynolds and that lady are fixing to stand up to Ware," said one passers-by. Another nodded. About time someone tried something new. A spark of hope ignited in Margaret's chest. Perhaps momentum was building. Yet a flicker of movement at the market's edge stole her attention. Two men loitered near an old oak tree, their gazes flicking between stalls. When she glanced their way, they promptly turned aside, pretending to study a display of honey jars. A chill pinched the back of her neck. It looked too much like surveillance. She recognized that style of watchfulness from her corporate days, when rivals hired private investigators to gather intelligence. Ware might be employing similar tactics. She said nothing to Oliver, not wanting to alarm him. After finishing at the market, they began the slow journey home, cart rattling along the pitted road. Oliver described a new compost system he wanted to try, each word laced with optimism. Margaret feigned interest, but her mind kept drifting back to the men by the oak tree. If Ware was using intimidation now, what would he do when he discovered the co-op's real potential to undermine his monopoly? As though sensing her disquiet, Oliver placed a hand on her shoulder. "You all right?" he asked. She managed a small smile. "Just tired. Been a long day." It wasn't a complete lie, though it hid a deeper fear. She vowed to remain vigilant, to protect Oliver and the others from any fallout until she could finalize her clandestine acquisitions. That week, a letter arrived in a nondescript envelope. Margaret retrieved it from the mailbox, heart pounding as she recognized the neat handwriting of her legal friend. She quickly pocketed it, hiding it from Oliver's view, then found a secluded spot by a gnarled oak to read the contents. Her eyes scanned each line. Negotiations were proceeding well, though certain banks were reluctant to sell the farm loans. But the biggest detail was that Caspian Ware's holding company had started snapping up defaulted properties at record speed, nearly doubling his domain within months. The letter concluded with a warning. If Margaret wanted to intervene, time was running short. She clenched the paper in trembling hands. Ware's aggression was accelerating, and she was still finalizing the legal framework to become a silent creditor. She felt both urgency and dread swirling inside her. By nightfall, she sat with Oliver at the table, the single lamp casting shadows that wavered with each draft. He was making lists of supply costs for the co-op, seeds, machinery repairs, feed. She watched him scribble figures. His brow creased in concentration, and a pang of guilt struck her. He had no idea she was working to rearrange the entire chessboard from behind the scenes. Yet her reasons for secrecy remained valid. Ware could retaliate swiftly if he discovered a wealthy outsider meddling in local loans. Sighing softly, she laid a hand on Oliver's wrist, halting his pen. "We'll figure this out," she said, voice steady. He nodded, though the tension remained visible in the set of his shoulders. "We have to," he answered simply. They both knew time was short. Over the next few days, preparations for the follow-up co-op meeting quickened. Margaret and Oliver visited farms, explaining how collective bargaining could reduce costs for seeds and fertilizer. Though some farmers remained skeptical, a fair number agreed to give it a try, especially after hearing about the new Ware memorandum that threatened harsher penalties for late payments. Each new recruit felt like one more piece of armor against the slow crush of debt. Meanwhile, Margaret kept a watchful eye out for suspicious visitors or lurking riders. She spotted them twice, silhouettes along the property line, faces hidden beneath hats, watching, waiting. The tension weighed heavier each time, and still no official move came from Ware. At dusk, on the eve of the next gathering, Margaret found herself at the barn door, gazing at the horizon's fading light. The sky was streaked with orange and lavender, a breathtaking scene that felt almost fragile in the face of looming conflict. She heard Oliver's voice behind her. "You're thinking about tomorrow?" She nodded, turning to see him with hands shoved into his pockets. "Yes," she whispered, "and everything else that's coming." He followed her gaze to the fields that stretched outward, battered but unbroken. "Just remember," Oliver said softly, "no matter how tough it gets, you're not alone. We've got each other." Something about his words made Margaret's heart twist, equal parts comfort and longing. She wished she could confide in him fully, but for now, she simply slipped her hand into his and let the quiet of evening enfold them. A silent promise that together they would not yield to fear. The morning dawned under an iron-gray sky, casting a stark light over Oliver's farm. The co-op gathering was scheduled for noon, and Margaret woke early, nerves already churning. From the barn loft, she heard Oliver tending to the chickens, his voice low and calm as he murmured gentle encouragements to the birds. She found herself smiling despite her unease. Even with the specter of Caspian Ware looming, Oliver remained steadfast. After splashing her face with cold water at the outdoor pump, she wandered into the yard. Clouds hung low and ominous, as though nature itself braced for a confrontation. Oliver brought out a small table and some wooden chairs, arranging them in a semicircle beneath the towering oak near the barn. "In case folks want to sit while we talk," he explained, giving Margaret a tentative grin. She nodded, grateful for any gesture of normalcy. Her eyes swept the perimeter of the property, half expecting to spot Ware's men lurking. No one was visible, yet a frisson of caution kept her on edge. She recalled the watchers in town, the riders who delivered threatening missives. Each reminder of Ware's reach amplified her resolve to protect this fragile alliance of farmers. By mid-morning, the first wagon rattled into view. Ethel arrived with an older neighbor, Mr. Hollis, who walked with a limp but carried a determined glint in his eye. They exchanged polite greetings before Ethel's gaze darted anxiously around the property. "So far, so good," Margaret said quietly, hoping to offer reassurance. Ethel just nodded, face grim. One by one, more farmers trickled in. Tobias, wearing a perpetually suspicious scowl, the Thompsons, who moved with the slow care of the elderly, and a handful of others who had scrounged time away from chores for the meeting. They formed a loose circle around the table, hats in hand or folded in their laps, each face etched with worry. Margaret, clipboard in hand, stepped into the center. Though her heart thudded, she summoned the composure she'd once relied on in corporate boardrooms. She thanked them for coming, her voice echoing just enough to carry. "We're all here because we believe in working together," she began, scanning the group. She explained the idea of pooled resources, bulk purchasing of seeds, community-owned equipment that could be shared, coordinated planting schedules to avoid market gluts. Whenever she paused, Oliver interjected practical suggestions, small tasks the co-op could handle right away, such as communal repairs for broken fences or tractor maintenance. Ethel spoke about the importance of solidarity, recounting how easily lenders exploited isolation. Tobias raised his hand, drawing everyone's eyes. "This all sounds hopeful," he said, "but suppose Ware decides to clamp down harder? He could raise rates the minute he sees us organizing." Murmurs rippled through the gathering. Margaret forced herself to stay calm. "There's strength in unity," she asserted. "He can't single out every farm if we stand firm. We'll explore legal protections too." She didn't mention her covert plan to purchase loans. The group fell silent, ruminating on her words. Finally, Tobias let out a slow breath and shrugged, as though conceding there was no simpler alternative. Across the circle, Mr. Hollis nodded in agreement. They spent nearly 2 hours hashing out details, collecting a small membership fee to cover initial shared costs, setting up a schedule for borrowing tools, deciding how to record transactions fairly. Margaret documented every suggestion, her neat handwriting filling page after page. Despite lingering apprehension, she sensed sparks of genuine optimism. Even the silence felt charged with resolve rather than defeat. By the time they broke for a midday meal, clouds drifted higher, revealing glimmers of sunshine. A tentative hope filtered through the group like a subtle warmth. Mrs. Thompson looked on the verge of tears, murmuring something about being grateful to see neighbors collaborate after so many lonely seasons. Oliver and Margaret served a simple lunch of cornbread, salted ham, and fresh tomatoes on a plank balanced between 2 barrels. The farmers ate in small clusters. Margaret noticed them exchanging ideas about fertilizer or irrigation, a glimmer of the knowledge sharing she'd envisioned. When Mr. Hollis mentioned his ancient tractor's broken engine, another farmer spoke up about leftover spare parts that might help. Watching these casual offers, Margaret felt a triumphant surge. This was the essence of the co-op, neighbors stepping in where they could, weaving a net to catch each other before they fell. Just as the meeting was set to conclude, the crunch of wagon wheels drew their attention. A sleek black carriage rolled up, its polished exterior a stark contrast to the worn farm vehicles around it. Margaret's pulse sped. The driver halted near the fence, and from inside emerged a tall, sharp-featured man in a charcoal suit. Even from a distance, his commanding posture radiated influence. Whispers hissed among the farmers, Caspian Ware in the flesh. Oliver bristled, but didn't flinch as Ware approached. Margaret found herself gripping the clipboard so tightly her knuckles hurt. Ware glanced around with cool disdain, his pale eyes assessing each face. The farmers drew closer together, forming a protective knot. "Busy day," Ware remarked, voice cutting through the hush. His gaze landed on Oliver, then flicked to Margaret. She stared back, keeping her features neutral. "I hear talk of a cooperative." He practically spat the word. Oliver nodded, chin lifted. "Yes, we're pooling resources to help each other out." Ware's lips twitched in something resembling a smile. "Sounds noble. But let's be practical. Most of you owe me money. Banding together won't change those debts." A tense silence fell. Tobias shifted his weight, fists clenched. Mrs. Thompson cast her eyes down. Ware pressed on. "You think you can outmaneuver me by buying supplies together? Maybe leveraging better terms at the feed store? But your land is still under my notes, and if you miss a payment, well, you know what happens." Margaret could sense the farmer's morale plummeting. She inhaled sharply, stepping forward. "Standing alone, each farm is vulnerable, but united, we have a chance. Even lenders must respect a strong collective." Ware turned his head slowly to face her, gaze narrowing. "I don't believe we've met, miss." She offered no name. "I'm a friend of Mr. Reynolds," she answered, her voice calm. His stare lingered, sharp as a knife, but she refused to waver. He said. "And what do you know about farmland, friend?" The sneer in his voice made her spine stiffen. "Enough to see that your interest rates are pushing these families into ruin," she retorted. Oliver's hand touched her elbow, a cautionary gesture. But the words had already been spoken. Ware's expression darkened. "This land was cheap for a reason. Droughts, unpredictable yields, risky for investors. The interest reflects that risk." He took a step nearer, looming like a thunderhead. "I have every legal right to enforce my contracts. If you people think you can cheat me by joining forces, you're mistaken." A low rumble of discontent spread through the farmers, but none challenged him outright. Margaret's pulse thundered. She wanted to fling the truth in his face, that she planned to buy his precious notes herself and dissolve his grip. Yet it was too soon. Sensing the standstill, Ware exhaled as though bored. "I'll leave you to your fantasies, but don't say I didn't warn you." With that, he spun on his heel, returning to the carriage. The driver snapped the reins, and the polished vehicle rolled away, leaving behind a tense hush. The farmers stared at each other, shaken by his brazen intrusion. Eventually, Tobias kicked at a pebble. "So that's how it's gonna be," he muttered. Margaret looked around, her own courage rekindling. "All the more reason to stick together," she said, attempting to rally them. Some nodded, though fear glimmered in others' eyes. Mrs. Thompson's hands trembled on her cane. "I can't face losing my home," she whispered. "But how do we fight a man like that?" Oliver cleared his throat. "We do it bit by bit," he said, a quiet ferocity in his voice. "Step by step, we follow the plan. We look out for each other." At those words, a fragile solidarity revived in the group. Ethel patted Mrs. Thompson's shoulder. Tobias mumbled that he wasn't quitting yet, and Mr. Hollis vowed to share his tractor parts. Margaret held on to these small sparks of bravery. It was all they had, yet it might be enough. When the farmers departed, leaving Oliver and Margaret alone in the yard, the afternoon sun slanted across the porch. A swirl of dust lingered where Ware's carriage had stood. Margaret set aside her clipboard, exhaling long and slow. She faced Oliver, aware that her cheeks still burned from the confrontation. "That was intense," she said. He nodded, eyes dark. "Ware knows we're serious now. I doubt he'll stay quiet." She glanced at the horizon, imagining how the next weeks might unfold. Ware would escalate his intimidation, perhaps. She had to accelerate her plans, finalize the quiet acquisition of loans before more harm could be done. They headed indoors, exhaustion weighing on both of them. Over cups of lukewarm tea, Margaret opened her notes, scanning names and tasks, building trust funds, securing equipment, establishing a rotating schedule. She saw the farmers' signatures on a half-completed agreement, each penned in shaky handwriting. It reminded her of the camaraderie they'd displayed, of how frightened people still reached for hope. She placed her hand atop Oliver's, giving a reassuring squeeze. "We'll make it," she said. "We have to." His gaze lingered on her face, something warm and appreciative flickering there. "You've already changed everything, Margaret," he murmured. "I can't imagine doing this without you." That night, she climbed to the barn loft and stared at the moonlit rafters, her pulse still thrumming. Images of Ware's sneer circled her mind, but so did the memory of unity among the farmers. Though fear beat like a drum, so did a quiet certainty that they were on the right path. She reached for her notebook, jotting down a reminder to write another letter to her legal ally, time to move faster, to press for the completion of the shadow purchases she had in mind. As the sky shimmered with countless stars, she thought of Oliver's unwavering support, of the desperate longing in Ethel's eyes, of the Thompsons' trembling hope. Whether or not Ware realized it, an unstoppable current had begun to flow through Greenock County, and Margaret, far from the corridors of wealth she once knew, was determined to see it through, no matter the cost. Morning brought a restlessness that Margaret couldn't shake. She woke before the sun, descended from the barn loft, and found Oliver already in the yard, rolling up his sleeves as if preparing for battle. The air felt charged in the wake of Caspian Ware's appearance at the co-op meeting. Though most farmers had left with resolve, fear still hovered in their eyes. Margaret sensed she had to act swiftly before Ware struck again. As she joined Oliver at the well pump, she studied his profile. Sharp lines of determination mingled with a quiet fatigue. Despite his stoic front, the tension in his shoulders betrayed how heavily the crisis weighed on him. They shared a quick breakfast, fried eggs and a pair of stale biscuits, then headed out to check the fence posts along the eastern edge of the property. It was a routine chore, but Margaret understood it served another purpose too. Oliver wanted to ensure no suspicious riders lurked near his boundaries. The two of them walked in silence at first, a breeze rippling through sun-bleached grass, carrying scents of wild sage. Eventually, Oliver halted by a broken post, set down the hammer and looked at her. "I didn't sleep much," he admitted, voice hushed. "Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Ware's face." Margaret nodded. "He rattled everyone," she replied gently. "But we can't let him scare us off." By mid-morning, they'd made their way around the entire perimeter. Oliver patted Clover's neck as the mare followed them, hauling supplies. Margaret recognized how crucial small tasks had become. Each repaired board or replaced nail felt like an act of defiance. She could see, however, that Oliver's funds were wearing thin. He used every leftover scrap of wood, improvising solutions to avoid costs. That afternoon, a dusty wagon arrived bearing a handful of co-op members, hoping to discuss next steps. Ethel was at the lead, cradling a tattered folder to her chest. "I've got receipts and old loan statements," she said firmly. "We need to figure out exactly how bad things are." They gathered under the same oak tree as before, the day's heat pressing down on them. Ethel opened her folder, spreading out papers yellowed with age. Margaret crouched to read them, heart clenching as she saw interest charges spiraling over the years. Tobias scanned the documents, muttering curses under his breath. Hollis squinted through his reading glasses, shaking his head in dismay. Ethel pointed to the largest figures. "We're drowning, and it's the same story for half the folks here. Doesn't matter if we have a better harvest. Ware keeps stacking fees." Margaret pressed her lips together, anger pulsing through her. She had to accelerate her hidden plan. If she could buy these debts through an intermediary, the farmers could renegotiate fairly. But how long before Ware discovered her interference? Oliver noticed her expression. He reached over and squeezed her hand in silent understanding. "Let's stay focused," he said to the group. "Co-op members need to pool whatever resources we have. We'll see if we can negotiate together, or at least keep each other afloat while we figure out a bigger strategy." A discussion ensued about immediate actions, small loans from neighbor to neighbor, seed sharing, even a communal water barrel for those whose wells were nearly dry. Though meager, it restored a semblance of hope, as if each small gesture wove a protective net around them. The next day, Margaret slipped away early to post a letter in town. The note was addressed to her legal ally, urging completion of the debt purchases with utmost haste. She emphasized the severity of Ware's intimidation tactics, making clear that each day of delay risked more evictions or forced sales. Stepping out of the tiny post office, she spotted the same pair of men who had watched her at the market. Their idle loitering near a horse trough sent alarm bells clanging in her mind. She kept her face neutral, but her heartbeat sped. As she passed them, she heard one mutter, "That's the woman at Reynolds' farm." She forced herself not to break stride. Once she reached Clover, she mounted swiftly and rode off. The men made no move to follow, yet their stares tracked her departure. The unsettling encounter left her jittery. Back at the farm, Oliver noticed her pallor as she dismounted. She confided in him, recounting the men's suspicious presence. Oliver's face hardened. "Ware's men, no doubt," he said quietly. "They're probably keeping tabs on who's meeting with us. Might even be trying to figure out who you are." A chill spread through Margaret. "We need to be careful," she managed, throat tight. Oliver agreed, but neither had a concrete solution to quell Ware's surveillance. They continued with the day's tasks, pretending nothing was amiss, yet Margaret felt the invisible eyes on them at every turn. That evening, she retreated to the barn loft sooner than usual, seeking solace among the hay bales. The drifting dust motes caught the last rays of sunlight in hazy patterns, reminding her how ephemeral safety could be. Sitting on a blanket, she pulled out her notebook and reread her own scribbles, lines about co-op expansions, irrigation strategies, new markets for crops, all brilliant on paper. But how to implement them if Ware launched a legal or physical assault on the farmers? She placed the notebook aside and closed her eyes, willing her racing thoughts to calm. Gradually, Clover's soft knickers from below lulled her toward rest. The next morning, Oliver and Margaret decided to visit 3 more neighbors further north: the Garcia family, known for their orchard, Mrs. DuPont, who managed a goat farm, and the Marshalls, who had only just joined the co-op after hearing about the plan. Each visit underscored the same grim refrain: soaring debts, decaying equipment, despair about the future. Yet all 3 households showed cautious support for the co-op. Mrs. Garcia offered apples, apologizing for their small size due to drought. Mrs. DuPont revealed she had modest savings tucked away and might lend it to neighbors. The Marshalls admitted their fields were nearly barren, but insisted they'd do whatever necessary to keep the co-op alive. Margaret's heart swelled with admiration for their courage. She took detailed notes, discreetly marking which families seemed in the most urgent need of loan restructuring. On their return trip, passing a barren stretch of land, Oliver slowed his steps. "That used to be the Smithson place," he said, voice heavy. "Bought up by Ware last month. They couldn't pay. Now it just sits here, rotting. Margaret stared at the sagging barn and the tumbleweeds gathering where crops once grew. The sight drove home the urgency. She clenched her jaw, thinking of her pending financial maneuvers. If she succeeded, farmland like this wouldn't be left to wither. At the same time, a gnawing fear warned her that Ware might escalate if he learned someone was reversing his acquisitions. A day later, while Margaret and Oliver were repairing the barn's roof, a messenger from town arrived with a telegram for Margaret. She froze at the name scrawled on the envelope, her legal contact. Hustling down the ladder, she excused herself and darted around the corner to read it in privacy. The terse lines confirmed that partial success had been achieved. Her lawyer had quietly purchased several overdue notes from a cooperative local bank. The documents were now in Margaret's name, albeit through a holding company. Elation surged in her chest, tempered by the knowledge that these were only a fraction of the debts. Still, it was a tangible victory. If those farmers defaulted, they'd now owe Margaret's company rather than Ware, giving her the freedom to waive penalties or restructure repayments. She tucked the telegram away, heart pounding with cautious optimism. That afternoon, she visited Ethel, who had no idea her entire loan had just changed hands. Margaret steered their conversation toward the subject of mortgage deadlines, probing whether Ethel had recently received any updates. Ethel shook her head, worriedly recounting how she had only a month left before foreclosure notices might arrive. Margaret's throat tightened, wishing she could say, "I own your note now, there's no need to fear," but revealing herself prematurely could attract Ware's wrath. Instead, she encouraged Ethel to remain calm for a bit longer, hinting that outside help might be on the way. Ethel clutched Margaret's hand, eyes brimming with relief at even that vague assurance. As dusk fell, Margaret found Oliver by the well, rinsing grime from his hands. She approached slowly, her pulse hammering with the urge to share her secret triumph, but trust and caution battled in her mind. She settled for a half measure, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Good news might be closer than we think," she said, voice subdued. He eyed her curiously. "You always seem sure of that," he replied with a soft laugh, though his gaze carried questions he didn't voice. The yearning to confide pressed at her chest, but she knew the timing wasn't yet right. Word trickled around the co-op that the Smithsons, who'd lost their farm, had been spotted packing a wagon at dawn, heading out of the county for good. Their departure sent shivers through those who stayed behind. Each time a family left, it felt like the slow death of a heritage. Margaret noticed new lines of tension crease Oliver's face. At the dinner table that evening, they ate in near silence, the lamplight accentuating his shadows. After the plates were cleared, he finally broke the hush. "Margaret, if this doesn't work, what will you do?" She looked at him, startled by the raw edge in his voice. "I'm not going anywhere," she said quietly. "As long as there's a chance, I'm staying to fight." His shoulders slumped in relief. "I don't know how you can be so sure," he murmured. "Most folks I've met would have run at the first sign of trouble." She laced her fingers with his, hoping the gesture conveyed how serious she was. "I've been around enough to know that real change only happens when people refuse to give up. You taught me that, Oliver." He smiled faintly, though worry remained in his eyes. "Just be careful," he whispered. "I won't let Ware hurt you." That night, a chill wind swept across the fields, rustling dead leaves and rattling shutters. Margaret climbed into the barn loft, heart weighed down by the knowledge of how precarious everything remained. On one hand, she'd made progress purchasing some of the loans, enough to protect certain farms. On the other, Ware still controlled vast portions of land and wielded considerable power in local offices. If he suspected an outsider was undoing his empire, he could retaliate, possibly with violence. Margaret lit a small lantern, the flame illuminating the worn beams overhead. She reflected on Oliver's unwavering promise to shield her, even without knowing her full story. He believed in her sincerity, and that trust was a precious gift she refused to betray. She opened her notebook to scribble the day's revelations: which farms were still at risk, which families might be saved by the newly purchased debt. Yet her mind drifted to what might happen when the time came to reveal the truth. Would the farmers resent her deception or be grateful for her intervention? Would Oliver feel betrayed once he realized she had the power of wealth all along? Shaking off the questions, she forced herself back to the pressing tasks. Whatever turmoil awaited, the immediate goal stood clear: secure more loans before they slipped into Ware's grasp. If she moved fast, families like Ethel's would never see another threatening note from him. As the lantern flickered low, she allowed herself one final glance at the yard below. The moonlight bathed Oliver's fields in silver, turning each blade of grass into a spectral shimmer. She thought of the farmers counting on the co-op, trusting her guidance. A tightness formed in her throat as the weight of responsibility settled deeper. Everything was poised on the brink. Yet amid the fear, she felt a stirring of fierce determination, a vow that if it took her last breath, she would not let Caspian Ware and his men crush the hope taking root in Greenock County. Sighing, she closed her notebook, the lines of possibility folding gently within its pages. Tomorrow would bring fresh challenges, but also fresh chances. The fight was far from over. The next few days passed in a flurry of cautious optimism. Margaret and Oliver spent long hours tending to chores, checking in on co-op members, and quietly encouraging anyone frightened by Ware's intimidation tactics. For a time, there were no ominous visits or unexpected riders showing up at Oliver's gate, and the absence of direct pressure lulled some folks into thinking Ware had backed down. But Margaret felt differently. Each morning, she scanned the horizon as though expecting a storm, convinced that silence from a man like Caspian Ware was never a good sign. News reached them that the Thompsons, struggling to keep up with medical expenses, might miss their next loan payment. Margaret's heart clenched at the thought. She had already forwarded a new letter to her legal contact, urging him to acquire any pending notes connected to the Thompsons. If all went well, those loans would transfer into her holding company, sparing the family from Ware's crushing fees. Each day, she scoured the mailbox in anticipation of good news, her anxiety mounting when nothing arrived. One evening, as Margaret paced near the barn, Oliver approached quietly, a rolled-up paper in hand. "Thought you might want to see this," he murmured, passing it to her. "It's from the county registry. Came along with a notice about property taxes." She smoothed the page beneath the lantern's glow. A cold dread gripped her as she read the lines. New legislation proposed by Ware's allies would allow lenders to expedite evictions if payments were more than 30 days overdue. She muttered a curse under her breath, prompting Oliver to lay a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We'll push back," he vowed, his voice shaking with anger he rarely displayed. Margaret nodded, but she felt the weight of the clock ticking. If Ware got this legislation passed, the co-op farmers would have even less time to stay afloat. Rallying, she proposed a plan. They would gather letters of protest from the co-op members, demanding fairer practices and an end to fast-track evictions. The idea excited Oliver, who immediately volunteered to speak with neighbors. Over the following days, they crisscrossed the county, collecting signatures. Margaret found the farmers surprisingly vocal, their early hesitation melting into fury at Ware's obvious power grab. Ethel, trembling with indignation, placed her name at the top of the list. Tobias, in his usual gruff manner, grumbled that the protest was likely useless, then signed anyway. Mrs. Garcia insisted on adding a carefully worded paragraph about preserving generational farms. By the end of the week, Margaret had a stack of letters almost an inch thick, each a plea for fairness. One afternoon, just as they were returning to Oliver's, Margaret spotted a familiar figure standing by the fence, hat tilted low. It was the same man she'd seen twice before, one of Ware's watchers. At the sound of wagon wheels, he turned abruptly, disappearing into the wind-bent grass. Oliver slammed the brakes, cursing under his breath. "He's getting bolder, coming right to the property line." Margaret leaped from the wagon, peering into the distance, but the man was gone. Her pulse hammered. If they were monitoring the farm so closely, it meant Ware knew they were collecting signatures. That knowledge served only to harden Margaret's resolve. She wasted no time. The following day, she visited the post office to send the thick bundle of protest letters to the local council members. On her way back, she detoured through the dusty back roads, wanting to see if the watchers would follow. She spotted no one, but the persistent sense of being observed nagged at her. At one point, Clover's ears pricked as though sensing another presence. Margaret scanned the sparse trees, but saw only rustling branches. Her fingers tightened around the reins, and she urged the mare onward, refusing to let fear dictate her actions. That evening, Oliver called a small meeting in his yard. A handful of farmers joined around a lantern-lit table, going over final co-op adjustments for the harvesting season. Mr. Hollis described how he and Tobias had repaired a dilapidated corn harvester so it could be shared by 3 families. Mrs. DuPont announced that her goats were producing more milk than she could use, so she offered the surplus to anyone struggling to buy food. The sense of unity in that circle of lantern glow was palpable, and despite the chilling knowledge of Ware's maneuvers, Margaret felt a warmth in her chest, proof that, step by step, they were forging a shield against his tyranny. When the meeting dispersed, leaving just Oliver and Margaret to tidy up stray chairs, he gave her a thoughtful look. "You're bringing folks together in a way I've never seen," he said quietly. "It's like they believe in something bigger than themselves now." She patted his arm. "We both did this," she replied. "All I did was nudge them in the same direction." He smiled, but his eyes gleamed with gratitude, an acknowledgement of how crucial her nudge had been. In the days that followed, Margaret caught wind of Caspian Ware's new scheme. Rumor had it that Ware planned to host a public forum in the county seat, a thinly veiled attempt to push through the fast-track eviction bill under the guise of open discussion. Outraged, Margaret rallied Oliver and the co-op members to attend. She saw it as their chance to voice opposition face to face. Though many were apprehensive, they agreed to stand together at the forum. Plans formed swiftly, with Margaret drafting talking points and Oliver organizing wagons so they could travel in a group. The tension felt electric, as though everyone sensed a defining moment was at hand. On the morning of the forum, the sky dawned a restless grey, fitting the undercurrent of anxiety. Margaret dressed simply, pulling her hair back in a neat braid. She glanced at herself in the small mirror Oliver kept in his hallway, noting how much more sun-touched her cheeks were compared to when she first arrived. Outside, the co-op farmers were already gathering in a hodgepodge caravan of wagons and horses. Ethel clutched her cane, trembling more from nerves than age. Tobias eyed the horizon with a grim set to his jaw. All told, there were about 10 of them who could afford to leave chores and make the trip. As they rode toward town, Oliver leaned close to Margaret in the wagon. "You sure you want to speak up?" he asked quietly. "Ware might get vindictive." Margaret met his worried gaze. "I have to. How else will the council know people want real solutions?" She swallowed hard, remembering her own secret solutions waiting in the wings. Perhaps, if the forum escalated, she could at least gauge Ware's next move. They reached the county seat by midday, where a modest stone building housed the council chambers. Already, a small crowd congregated on the steps, some wearing expressions of curiosity, others apprehension. At the sight of Caspian Ware's black carriage parked out front, Margaret's stomach tightened. The farmers filed into the assembly hall, a high-ceilinged room with rows of wooden benches. Town officials occupied a raised dais, their faces showing practiced neutrality. Ware stood off to one side, surrounded by a few of his associates. His cold blue eyes darted over the newcomers, lingering briefly on Margaret, who pretended not to notice. With a sharp rap of the gavel, the council leader, a balding man with spectacles, opened the forum. Speeches about economic progress followed, each one subtly painting Ware's proposals as beneficial to responsible borrowers. When the floor opened to comments, Margaret stepped forward, heart in her throat. She introduced herself only as Margaret, a friend of the local farmers. Then, she calmly dismantled Ware's rhetoric, pointing out that these so-called responsible terms came at the expense of the vulnerable. Fast-track evictions won't solve the agricultural crisis, she concluded. They'll only hasten the demise of small farms, leaving the land to rot or be bought at bargain prices. Applause broke out among the co-op members. Margaret's pulse hammered. She had never spoken so boldly in public about such a charged topic. Ware narrowed his eyes. Others from the co-op took the stand. Ethel, her voice shaking but strong. Tobias gruffly recounting how he'd nearly lost his home to predatory fees. Mr. Hollis, who described how generations had farmed his acreage. Each testimony painted a dire but hopeful picture. Yes, they were struggling, but with fair terms and cooperative solutions, they could rebuild. Margaret felt an immense pride as she watched them speak, their collective voice resonating through the hall. Yet her gaze kept flicking to Ware, whose composure never cracked. He stood with arms folded, a slight smirk twisting his lips. When the council finally turned to him for a rebuttal, he straightened and launched into a smooth, polished defense of his policies, evoking words like responsibility and market forces. Just as he concluded, a council member asked, "But what about these farmers' concerns about unjust fees?" Ware offered a chilly smile. "The terms are laid out clearly in every contract. Nobody is forced to sign." His associates murmured agreement. "I sympathize with their hardships, but we must balance compassion with economic realism." The council leader nodded, brow furrowed. The room buzzed with conflicting energy, half in admiration of Ware's smoothness, half in outrage at his callousness. After the forum adjourned, Margaret and Oliver lingered outside with the co-op group. Dark clouds gathered overhead, promising rain. Ware emerged, flanked by his men. He paused, as if debating whether to speak, then strode over. "You're eloquent," he said, fixing Margaret with an icy stare, "for someone who just showed up in this county." Before she could respond, Oliver interjected, voice tight with anger. "She's got more genuine care for this place than you ever will." Ware's lips curled in distaste. "We'll see how caring she is when those overdue notices come due. My guess is she'll leave you high and dry." Then he turned on his heel, heading to his carriage. Oliver cursed under his breath, and some of the farmers muttered anxiously as Ware's carriage disappeared into the gloom of the gathering storm. Margaret placed a steadying hand on Oliver's arm. "He wants us to doubt ourselves," she whispered. "Don't let him." An uneasy hush settled over them. Rain began to patter on the cobblestones, so they hurried back to their wagons, hearts heavy with the realization that their plea might have fallen on deaf ears. Yet as they made the trek back to the farm in a downpour, Margaret couldn't help but feel a spark of determination. The hearing might not have swayed the council completely, but they had stood up to Ware in public, showing a unified front. And unbeknownst to him, She was steadily buying up critical debts behind the scenes. The storm might break them, or, if their faith held, cleanse the ground for new growth. A low, smouldering tension hung in the air as the wagons rattled back to Oliver's farm. The storm that threatened during the council forum finally broke in the late afternoon, unleashing sheets of cold rain across Greenock County. By the time Margaret and the others arrived home, their clothes were soaked and their spirits weighed down. Everyone felt the same dread. It was uncertain whether their brave testimonies would sway the council enough to counter Caspian Ware's proposed legislation. Yet even as the stench of wet mud and worry pervaded the yard, Margaret clung to a fragile sense of hope. Standing up to Ware in public was no small achievement, and small gains, she reminded herself, could accumulate into a formidable defense. Oliver helped unhitch the horses. Arms stiff from the chill, he guided Clover under the barn's overhang, rubbing her flanks until her trembling subsided. Margaret joined him there, brushing away droplets of water clinging to Clover's mane. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and the sky took on a metallic hue. For a moment, neither spoke, just the soft hush of rain and the horses' snorts filled the silence. At last, Oliver exhaled. "Feels like we're waiting for the other shoe to drop," he said, voice barely audible above the downpour. Margaret nodded, her throat tight. "I know. But at least we have each other." That evening, a few co-op members stayed behind at Oliver's to discuss next steps, their wagons and horses forming a small caravan in the soggy courtyard. Tobias was among them, warming his hands by the stove as he scowled at the window streaked with rain. "Ware's not done," he muttered. "Mark my words, he'll push that eviction bill through, no matter what we said." Ethel, soaked cloak draped around her shoulders, refused to succumb to despair. "If the council passes it, maybe we can raise an appeal at the state level," she suggested, though worry pinched her features. Margaret found a quiet corner near the fireplace to review her notes, the pages curling from humidity. She wanted to reassure them that a quiet rescue was underway, the debt acquisitions, but still she held back, aware that secrecy remained her strongest shield. Oliver brought out a kettle of warm tea. Steam curled upward as he poured cups for each guest. In the flickering glow of the oil lamp, the farmers appeared haggard but resolute. They agreed to keep pressing the council, writing fresh letters and encouraging absent neighbors to speak up. Mrs. DuPont pledged to hire a traveling notary so that elderly farmers could submit formal protests without trekking all the way to town. Through it all, Margaret observed the delicate balance of fear and solidarity. These men and women could easily lose everything, yet none spoke of surrender. The meeting concluded on a note of guarded optimism, and though the clouds still spat rain, the small group trudged back to their wagons with heads lifted a fraction higher. The following morning, Margaret rose early to check the mailbox, heart racing in anticipation. Rain had ceased, leaving shallow puddles glinting in the pale dawn light. She found no letter from her legal contact, only a flyer trumpeting a special discount on feed from one of Ware's affiliated merchants, an obvious ploy to lure unsuspecting farmers into deeper debt. Frowning, she tucked the paper under her arm. As she turned to head back, she caught sight of Oliver approaching on foot, carrying a small bundle of kindling. He wore a grim expression that made her tense. "What's wrong?" she asked quietly. He extended a telegram. "Came for you," he explained, jaw set. Margaret's pulse quickened as she unrolled it. The terse message was from her lawyer, announcing that final negotiations for the Thompsons and Ethel's loans had been successful. They now resided in the holding company Margaret controlled. She felt a surge of relief, then realized Oliver was studying her face intently. "Is it bad news?" he asked, concern plain in his eyes. Her fingers trembled around the paper. She swallowed the truth, forcing a neutral tone. "No," she whispered. "It's just an update from an old friend." Anxiety warred with joy inside her, even as she rejoiced for the families unknowingly freed from Ware's clutches. Guilt gnawed at her for keeping Oliver in the dark. By midday, Ethel visited with fresh worry. "I got another letter from Ware's office," she said, voice trembling. "They say if I can't pay by the end of next week, foreclosure begins. I don't know what to do." Her eyes darted between Oliver and Margaret, begging for solutions. The telegram still weighed heavily in Margaret's pocket. She yearned to declare that Ethel's loan was already safe, that Ware's threat now held no legal power, but it was too soon to reveal her hidden role. Instead, Margaret offered a gentle squeeze of Ethel's hand. "Give it a few more days. Something might change," she said. Ethel blinked, a spark of hope lighting her features, though confusion lingered. As days melted into a week, the tension soared. The dryness returned, transforming the county's roads into swirling dust. Margaret heard rumors that Ware was calling in favors among local politicians to force the eviction bill through faster. She watched Ethel and the Thompsons grow increasingly frantic, preparing to pack if an eviction notice arrived. At the same time, no one realized their loans were already sold off to a mysterious buyer not beholden to Ware. Margaret wrote more frantic letters, urging her legal ally to finalize all documentation swiftly. Every dawn, she checked the mailbox, heart hammering. The sequence was always the same. Routine bills, a notice about the upcoming harvest festival in Morningside, or trivial advertisements, but never the confirmation she craved. One afternoon, she and Oliver were reinforcing the chicken coop with new planks when they spied a cloud of dust on the western horizon. Two riders emerged, clad in black dusters, approaching at a gallop. Fear seized Margaret's chest. Were they Ware's enforcers, come to terrorize them again? Oliver set aside his hammer, jaw tight. He moved to intercept the riders, standing squarely at the yard's edge. Margaret slipped behind a stack of wooden boards, her heart thudding painfully. One man dismounted, tipping his hat. "Mr. Reynolds?" he asked in a clipped tone. Oliver crossed his arms. "That's me." The rider produced a folded document. "We're from the county clerk's office. This is a final notice about the proposed eviction legislation. The council will vote in 2 days." He paused, scanning the yard. "We are tasked with informing landowners who may be affected." Oliver took the paper with a curt nod. "We already know about the vote. Thank you." The man nodded once more, then climbed back onto his horse. In moments, they vanished, leaving a swirl of dust in their wake. Margaret stepped out from her hiding spot, dread swirling through her. If the council approved fast-track evictions, even her quiet maneuvers might not be enough. Families could be kicked out before the co-op could negotiate new terms, or even before the legal transfer of their loans was fully recognized. That evening, the co-op held an emergency meeting in Oliver's barn. Lanterns dangled from beams, throwing nervous shadows across the straw-covered floor. Ethel, Tobias, Mr. Hollis, and a half-dozen others gathered in a tight circle. They all looked to Margaret for guidance, which weighed on her like a leaden mantle. She explained that if the vote passed, they'd have little time to appeal before eviction orders took effect. Tobias slammed a fist into his palm, cursing under his breath. "So we fight at the council again," he declared. "We can't let them do this." Oliver glanced at Margaret. "We'll show up, speak out, and if they still vote yes..." He trailed off, the unspoken doom thick in the humid air. Margaret nodded, mind racing. At best, her purchased loans could protect a handful of families from Ware's reach, but dozens more would remain vulnerable. Her only chance now might be to broaden the buying spree, sweeping in as many loans as possible before the law took effect. But how could she arrange such a massive intervention in mere days without tipping off Ware or forcing him to retaliate immediately? Sensing her turmoil, Oliver caught her gaze. She could almost see questions dancing behind his eyes, why her expression shifted from grim to determined, why she sometimes disappeared to mail letters at odd hours. Yet he said nothing, trusting her motives, if not her methods. 2 days later, the county seat bustled with tension. Farmers, townsfolk, and a smattering of local merchants converged on the council chambers for the eviction bill's final hearing. Margaret, Oliver, and the co-op members arrived early, armed with newly gathered signatures. They filed into the same austere hall, where the council sat behind high desks. Caspian Ware was already there, leaning against a pillar with studied indifference. His men, scattered among the benches, cut an intimidating figure. Margaret recognized the watchers from the feed store and the men in black dusters. An icy dread coiled in her stomach, but she forced her posture to remain tall. The council leader hammered his gavel. Today's subject is Bill 8F, concerning expedited eviction protocols. He eyed the crowd, subdued murmurs rippling through the room. Oliver rose first, calmly stating that these farms were the backbone of Greenock County, and evicting families with little warning would devastate the local economy. Ethel spoke next, voice trembling yet resolute. Then Mr. Hollis and a handful of other farmers whose property teetered on the brink of foreclosure. Each time someone paused, the watching men in black dusters exchanged glances. Finally, Margaret took the floor. Her throat felt raw, and she had to steady herself against the wooden lectern. This legislation punishes families who have nurtured this land for generations, she said, scanning the council members. A short grace period might allow them to restructure loans, find new markets, or secure outside investment. Ware shifted, crossing his arms. She pressed on. We do not ask for charity. We ask for fairness. Many stand ready to pay what they owe, if given time. As she spoke, she noticed Ware's expression darken, a flicker of recognition lighting his eyes. His gaze bore into her, as though trying to pierce her secret. When she finished, applause rippled across the room. Though Ware and his men remained silent, the council members went into a brief recess, and the chamber erupted in anxious whispers. Margaret stepped aside to catch her breath. Oliver joined her, face taut. "You did good," he whispered, resting a hand on her shoulder. "Let's hope it matters." She stared at the wooden panels underfoot, trying not to imagine Ware's potential retaliation. She could sense him nearby, a cold presence in her peripheral vision. Across the room, Ethel stood with shoulders squared, an unspoken question in her worried eyes. Margaret forced a reassuring nod. Outside, thunderheads gathered again, as if echoing the county's roiling fear. Whether or not the council voted in their favor, Margaret vowed she would not stop fighting, and if they lost, she would accelerate her hidden rescue plan, no matter the personal risk. When the council members returned from their recess, the chamber went still. Each official resumed his seat, papers shuffled, and the council leader cleared his throat. Outside, thunderclouds closed ranks, their grey weight pressing on the old stone walls. Margaret stood among her fellow farmers, heart hammering so loudly that she barely caught the council leader's first words. "After much deliberation, we have reached a decision regarding Bill 8FE. A hush rippled outward. Ethel clasped her cane more tightly. Oliver inhaled sharply, bracing for the worst. Then, in a measured tone, the man continued, "The council, by a vote of 4-3, has elected to adopt a revised form of the bill. The fast-track eviction timeline will be extended from 30 days to 90 days. A startled murmur spread through the hall. 90 days was still harsh, but it tripled the original grace period and might give farmers time to stave off immediate ruin. Margaret exhaled in relief. Some neighbors even broke into quiet cheers. Caspian Ware stood at the far edge of the room, jaw tight, saying nothing. The council leader rapped his gavel and added, "While this modification provides additional time, the eviction protocols remain enforceable. We urge all landowners to settle their debts promptly. This session is adjourned." People began to disperse, talking in hushed voices about the partial victory. Margaret felt Oliver's hand find hers in the crowd, a silent gesture of both gratitude and lingering trepidation. 90 days were a boon, but the fight was hardly over. Outside, the sky had darkened further, and a smattering of cold raindrops dusted the steps. Some farmers lingered around Margaret, relief etched in their smiles. 90 days, that's something, Mr. Hollis said. Tobias, crossing his arms, begrudgingly agreed. Ethel wiped tears of thanks from her eyes. Margaret offered each a reassuring nod, though inside she knew the real race had just begun. She was determined to finalize the loan acquisitions during this window, ensuring that nobody would be served with Ware's notices again. The farmers parted ways under the building storm, spines a little straighter. Even Tobias tipped his hat at Margaret in thanks. Oliver and Margaret slipped around the corner, seeking the wagon they had tethered behind the courthouse. The moment they were alone, Oliver pressed a hand to her shoulder. "That extra time is a blessing," he said softly. "But you look more worried than relieved." Margaret glanced away, swallowed hard. "I'm just thinking about what we need to do next. 90 days can pass in a blink." Thunder grumbled overhead. Oliver's brows drew together as he reached for her hand. "Margaret, what is it you haven't told me?" Her pulse flickered, old instincts urging her to deflect, but the sincerity in his voice shook her resolve. Before she could speak, thunder cracked again, shattering the moment. They both looked skyward, raindrops pelting their faces. Oliver sighed. "We should get home before the storm turns worse." Margaret nodded, hastily climbing onto the wagon, secrets still lodged in her throat. The storm's fury descended the entire drive back. Sheets of rain battered the wagon and whipped across the fields, turning the dirt roads into slick mud ruts. Clover trudged ahead with stubborn resilience, and Margaret clutched the reins, unable to think about anything except guiding them safely past half-flooded ditches. By the time they reached Oliver's farm, dusk was falling in watery streaks. Everything dripped in gloom, save for the faint glow of a lantern bobbing near the barn, where Tobias waited, having rushed over to share the news with anyone not at the council session. He flashed a tight smile as they dismounted. "Heard about the extension. Could be worse," he greeted. Then, under the barn's overhang, he quietly explained that some neighbors already asked about paying down their debts or finding short-term solutions. Margaret nodded, water trickling down her collar. That night, once Tobias left, Oliver and Margaret dragged themselves indoors, drenched and exhausted. Yet before they could settle, a frantic pounding came at the door. Oliver hurried to open it and found Ethel, soaked through, her eyes wide with fright. She held a letter, the edges soggy. "Got this at dusk," she cried, voice trembling. "It's from Ware. He says my loan has been sold, and if I don't pay up, eviction still applies." Oliver blinked, casting Margaret a startled glance. Margaret's heart lurched. This must mean the final transfer to her holding company was complete, even though Ethel had received the notification in Ware's name first. She swallowed, choosing words carefully. "Let's not panic yet," she said, pulling Ethel gently inside. "Sometimes these letters are slow or confusing. It could mean you've actually got a new creditor who might be kinder." Ethel stared, baffled. Margaret knelt by her side, voice steady. "Give me a day or two to look into this, all right? I think you might find the terms more forgiving than you expect." Ethel blinked, tears still running down her cheeks. She nodded, clinging to that glimmer of hope. With renewed composure, she departed, leaving Oliver and Margaret alone once more. He immediately turned on her, albeit gently. "Margaret, something's going on. You've mentioned outside help before, and you don't seem surprised by that letter at all." She hesitated, realizing she couldn't stall any longer. Breathing deeply, she led him to the kitchen table, lit a lantern, and sank into a chair. "I should have told you sooner," she began, voice tinged with regret. "I come from a background of wealth, more than you'd ever guess. I left that life because I was tired of the greed and power plays. When I saw how people here were suffering, I started buying their loans through a private holding company. That means Ethel's loan isn't truly Ware's to enforce anymore. Technically, she owes me, but I plan to forgive the harsh terms and give her time to recover." A stunned silence filled the small kitchen. Rain drummed on the roof, and the lantern's flame quivered. Oliver's eyes widened, confusion giving way to shock. Then something like relief. "So you're the one behind those notes," he whispered. Margaret nodded, tears threatening to sting her eyes. "I'm sorry I kept it from you. If Ware learned an outsider with funds was undermining his empire, he'd lash out. I wanted to protect everyone, including you." She braced for anger or betrayal in Oliver's response. Instead, he simply leaned back in his chair, exhaling shakily. "I wish you'd trusted me sooner," he said, tone soft. "But I understand why you couldn't, and I'm grateful. I truly am. You've saved these families from disaster." Relief flooded Margaret's chest, warming her from within. She took Oliver's hand, marveling at his unflagging kindness. "We're not done," she warned him. "Ware still owns plenty of land and more notes that I haven't been able to secure. But with the extra 90 days, I can keep working. That should protect the rest of the co-op if all goes well." Oliver's gaze flickered with a new intensity. "Then let's do it openly. People might accept it more easily if I vouch for you. They already trust you, even if they don't know your full story." Margaret hesitated. "Won't that paint a target on your back?" He shook his head. "Ware already views me as trouble. I'd rather stand beside you than let you shoulder the risk alone." The tenderness in his voice nearly undid her. Early the next morning, while grey light crept through the curtains, they devised a plan. Margaret would announce that she had secured a philanthropic backer willing to buy farm loans. She would remain behind the curtain legally, but at least farmers would be prepared when they discovered their paperwork had changed hands. By midday, they assembled co-op members in the barn, Ethel among them. When Margaret stood at the makeshift podium, a simple plank atop 2 crates, her heart pounded as if she were reliving the council forum. She cleared her throat. "Friends, I've mentioned that help might come from outside. Well, it's here," she began. Nervous glances flicked around. Ethel clutched her letter. "The entity who purchased some of these loans isn't tied to Ware," Margaret continued carefully. "They want to give farmers fair terms, or even forgive penalties. Essentially, you'd have a fresh start, with enough time to pay your debts at a manageable pace." Murmurs of astonishment rippled through the group. Tobias fixed her with a fierce stare. "Who's behind it?" he demanded. Margaret smiled faintly. "A trust that I helped organize, financed by private donors who believe in sustainable agriculture. They have no interest in seizing your land." She pointed to Ethel. "You received a confusing notice because Ware wanted to scare you one last time, but that note means you're no longer bound to him." Ethel gasped, tears welling up, and stumbled forward to embrace Margaret. The barn erupted in excited chatter. For the first time since the co-op's inception, Margaret saw unbridled relief on every face. Oliver stepped forward, resting a hand on Margaret's shoulder. "She's been working on this quietly for a while now," he said. "We owe her, and this trust, more than we can express. But let's not forget, Ware's going to fight back when he realizes what's happening." The farmers sobered, nodding. Margaret raised a hand for silence. "We have 90 days before the eviction law truly bites. That gives us time to finalize any outstanding purchases. If you get a letter about your loan transferring, bring it to me. We'll arrange new terms or a grace period. Keep it quiet outside the co-op until everything's secured." With that, they broke into smaller groups, voices low but jubilant, discussing which neighbors might still be in jeopardy. After the meeting, Ethel lingered, tears glistening. "I can't thank you enough," she whispered, clutching Margaret's hands. "When I first met you, I thought you were just a wanderer. Now you've saved my family's home." Margaret squeezed her fingers warmly. "I'm glad to help," she said, voice catching in her throat. "Really?" One by one, the others departed, leaving only Oliver and Margaret in the barn. Afternoon light filtered through knotholes in the walls, illuminating motes of dust. Oliver turned to her, eyes bright. "You did it," he murmured. Margaret felt tears prick. "We did it," she corrected, stepping closer. The raw emotion of the moment swept them both up, and before either realized it, Oliver was wrapping her in a gentle, grateful embrace. Outside, the remnants of the storm had passed, leaving the sky a dazzling blue. Margaret rested her head on Oliver's shoulder, marveling at how a single act of trust, hers in using her fortune for good, his in accepting her hidden identity, could spark such profound change. Of course, Caspian Ware still lurked, and fresh battles loomed. But for now, they clung to the victory shining in each other's eyes. These fields, once overshadowed by dread, now carried a new promise, that when people joined together, aided by those with the means and the heart to help, any odds can be overcome. Oliver tightened his arms around Margaret, and they stood there in the fading light, resolute and unafraid, ready to face whatever came next in Greenock County. Together,